sunshine, goodbye rain. She's wearing my school ring on the chain. She's my steady, I'm her man. I'm gonna love her all I can. This day is all to be mine. This day is all. Happy days.
Nostalgia for the 1950s can be divided into two distinct yet related subjects. There is the personal memories of senior citizens of specific ages who would have been teenagers between the years 1955 to 1962, the rock and roll era. Then there is specifically the 50s nostalgia fad, a craze that swept the United States, Britain, and many other countries during the 1970s. For Americans, it was a feel-good revival expressed through the rediscovery of specific rock and roll songs, usually the most sedate mainstream teen ballads, and expressed through certain iconic movies, TV shows, and a specific musical stage play turned movie. Considering that both West Side Story and The Cape Man has already been covered, this last category would also seem to be a common theme. To be sure, Jim Jacobs and Warren Casey's 1971 musical comedy turned 1978 movie is one of the major influences on how today's mainstream remembers 50s era juvenile delinquency, less as emotionally troubled or marginalized youth from dysfunctional homes or impoverished neighborhoods, where a willingness towards violent behavior was not only the norm, but sometimes even something to be admired, but instead as mischievous pranksters in leather jackets, bad but not really bad, whose behavior was certainly nothing like the violent gangs of today who engage in street drugs and shootings. This is the depiction of the cute, lovable, and harmless gangs featured in Grease, as well as in American Graffiti, The Lords of Flatbush, and Happy Days, though to be fair, in the case of the first season of Happy Days, before the show switched to a live audience format, one episode, Knock Around the Block, did show street gangs for what they actually were, and for their potential for violent crime, within the confines of a 1970s family-friendly sitcom, of course. Combine these fictional comedic portrayals with the fact that, unlike today's teens who are connected through social media, the teens of the 1950s generally kept within their own social circle. The only real interest 1950s era teens showed towards other teens from around the country was the upper middle class teen interest in the dancers on Philadelphia's American Bandstand. And that was it. It's one reason why, if one were to question an American senior citizen of a specific age if they've ever heard of the Bandstand regulars Bob Clayton and Justine Corelli, or Arlene Sullivan and Ken Rossi, they might be familiar with those names, regardless of where they grew up. But ask a non-New York or non-Philadelphia senior citizen of the same age if they've ever heard of The Cape Man, Salvador Agron, or The Umbrella Man, Luis Hernandez, or if they remember the tragedy of In Ho Oh, and most likely those names would draw blank, in spite of the fact that the Cape Man murders were national news in 1959, and the beating murder of In Ho Oh was international news in 1958. The adults of the 1950s were concerned with youth crime, while their teenage children's interest in the subject, provided that these were families from affluent neighborhoods with relatively low crime rates, was specifically focused on the aforementioned fictional movies such as Rebel Without a Cause and West Side Story. And to these specific 1950s teens, who admittedly make up the majority, juvenile delinquency of their youth consisted of their upper-middle-class friends who saw James Dean up on the screen and imitated his style of dress, his mannerisms, and his on-screen attitude, without any of the actual reasons, such as poverty, mental health issues, substance abuse, or dysfunction that motivated someone like Salvador Agron or Charles Starkweather. and that remembrance is just a step away from the comical fiction of Grease, the bad but not really bad pharaohs in American Graffiti, or the pre-Rocky, pre-Fonzie Lords of Flatbush. This comical fiction of 1950s juvenile delinquents that elicits both a strange sort of affection for a simpler, carefree, as in relatively non-violent, time, along with disdainful chuckles from the mainstream, is a product of an America recovering from the shock of the late 1960s, particularly the Vietnam War, the first war to be televised, bringing the horrific realities of armed conflict into American homes on a daily basis. The shadow of Vietnam was often dangled to viewers in some of these 1970s, 50s nostalgia films, with both American Graffiti and The Wanderers, a movie specifically about New York gangs, being examples, as both movies were actually set in the early 1960s, when America's involvement in Southeast Asia was beginning to expand. This sanitized, bad but not really bad 50s delinquent greaser, a Chicago and Great Lakes term that was never used by the Bops of New York, nor the Barts, Munns, Pachucos, and White Shoes of San Francisco, became the humorous mascot for selling repackaged rock and roll oldies collections during the 70s era 50s nostalgia fad, and that mascot is still with us today. It's why children's sock hop costumes resemble the stereotype of the post-war youthful criminal, an image that did consist of actual real-life convicted killers, though it's a fact that most parents, and probably even most grandparents, are unaware of. As the shadow of Vietnam looms in the narrative of some of these nostalgic movies, it shouldn't come as a surprise that the first use of the delinquent stereotype as a funny, goofy mascot for rock and roll oldies came in 1969 at Woodstock, the iconic 3 to 4 day music festival that was a celebration of the hippie counterculture. There, amidst the various acid rock and folk bands, the Columbia University neo-doo-wop group, formerly known as the King's Men, made their big debut as Sha Na Na, singing the songs that would later be included in those oldies packages while dressed in the stereotype of a 50s era teenage gangster. Considering that rock and roll's association with youth crime goes back to 1955's Blackboard Jungle and its use of Rock Around the Clock over the opening credits, combined with the counterculture's disdain for the thin neckties, pegged slacks, and leisure suits favored just a few years before, not only by mainstream society but by actual 50s era doo-wop groups, Sha Na Na's use of a laughable parody of 50s streetwear was probably the right move at the time. And that is the image of the 1950s juvenile delinquent that is with us today. That laughable mainstream image is also why we have avoided the use of the term 50s juvenile delinquent in the title of this video and have instead opted for the title post-war youth crime. The contributors to this video have found out the hard way that the term 50s juvenile delinquency sparks images of Fonzie and Grease's Danny Zuko while eliciting chuckles rather than serious discussions about the socio-political ramifications of the Michael Farmer, Alvin Palmer, In Ho Oh, or Cape Man murder trial cases between 1957 through 1959. Curiously, if the 1970s fad for 50s nostalgia eradicated the actual reality of post-war youth crime from collective mainstream memory, while utilizing the visual stereotype of the 50s teen gangster to sell oldies LP collections, Halloween sock hop themed costumes, and retro-themed diner menu items, another movement that recalled 50s roots rock and roll music. This movement, originating in Britain with an influence from America's East Coast, revived the interest in the actual history of post-war youth crime, while also introducing its adherents to the more rarer and wilder sounds of 1950s youth music culture. But that's an involved story worthy of another video. This was an introductory video into the history of 1950s era youth crime made by fans for fans of 1950s youth culture. It is a different approach towards mid-century youth culture. For fans who enjoyed this video and would like more documentaries with this fan approach towards 1950s culture, we have several YouTube documentaries which are posted for free educational viewing. For those who would like to support the continued research that goes into making these videos, we also have a Patreon page and a new 1950s documentary series separate from the free YouTube videos and exclusively for Patreon patrons, which will give a detailed look at specific individual cases and incidents of 1950s era youth crime. And that will be up soon. The lives and backgrounds of the Cape Man as well as the Brooklyn Thrill Killers, among others, will be detailed, and for fellow researchers, you do not want to miss that series when it comes out. The links for all of these videos and projects are included in the description of this post. Please feel free to share this video and spread the word as we want to reach more fans, particularly fans who would like a different and a more grounded, realistic, and perhaps a bit more grittier look at the time period that we know to be much more interesting and relevant than how the mainstream usually and sadly laughingly portrays it.